Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's business studies lesson. My name is Grace Sikosana. This lesson is brought to you by Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Sci-Bono Discovery Center. And it is also broadcasted by Pagama Research and Development. Today we are proceeding with our topic, which is the impact of recent legislation on business. From the previous two lessons, we have already covered 6 acts out of 8. All these acts are going to be assessed as contextual questions as well as essays. This includes the last 2 acts. The focus of today's lesson is the National Credit Act and the Consumer Protection Act. Now, it is very much important that I must emphasize that these 2 acts are completely different. They are not the same. Now, you will remember that out of all the acts that have been taught already, it is crucial that you must understand that when they are going to be assessed, they are always going to be assessed under 5 aspects. Can you remember those aspects? I can hear somebody talking about the purpose, yes. I can hear also somebody talking about the impact. From the impact, then you go to the discriminatory actions. Then from there you go to how these acts must be complied with. Furthermore, ending up with the penalties that can be charged should there be non-compliance. Now, as well as these 2 acts, National Credit Act and Consumer Protection Act, both of them, they are also going to be assessed under those 5 aspects. Now, those 5 aspects that I've already mentioned, they are also our today's lesson objectives. By the end of today's unit, you must be able to outline, describe, discuss the purposes of both of these acts. Now, take note of those action verbs that are used. You must also be able to discuss or evaluate the impact of these 2 acts. You should also be able to explain. Now look at the change of the action verbs. We are no longer outlining the actions that must be regarded as discriminatory. You are also going to be expected to be able to explain all those actions that are regarded as non-compliance. And again, you are also going to be expected to outline, discuss penalties or consequences for non-compliance for both National Credit Act and Consumer Protection Act. Then lastly, you must come up with ways, you must come up with suggestions, recommend, look also at those action verbs that are used. Recommend, suggest ways in which business can comply with the National Credit Act and Consumer Protection Act. Now you will note that there is also another added aspect which is speaking about rights of consumers. Now this is one aspect that has not been studied thorough with the other acts that have already been taught. So it should raise your interest to say, apart from the 5 aspects that you are expected to master for all the other acts, remember that with National Credit Act and Consumer Protection Act, which is going to be discussed later, those acts, they are also saying add more. Add another aspect, which is outline, explain, describe or discuss the rights of consumers in terms of these 2 acts. And as we proceed further, it is going to be very much important and for you to be relevant in answering the questions that are based on National Credit Act, for instance. It is very critical that you must first start by understanding exactly what is National Credit Act. Now, if you look at the background, before this act was endorsed, remember it is coming from the macro environment. Now, as you can see that picture depicts what used to happen before National Credit Act came into existence. Remember, it is recent legislation. You can see that this act, it used to have people like creditors that never bothered to check the interest of their clients. creditors would just give unwarranted credit, regardless of the affordability of the poor customers. The picture on its own is saying a big story, which used to happen before National Credit Act was introduced. Now, in redressing that unfair treatment, in redressing what the creditors used to do, whereby they would only take money out of the poor clients without even looking as to whether are they affording, then there came the act which is called National Credit Act. All it does, it is there to manage credit granting. So it is looking at the market where credit, where goods and services are rendered or sold without the payment of cash. So to avoid all this abuse that we see that used to happen in the beginning, now the macro environment is bringing this legislation to bring order in the credit market, to ensure that not only the creditors are getting the power, as you can see, he's fat, he's getting all the power, which is unfair. So as much as we are still entertaining the credit trading, the credit selling of products, but it should be noted that through National Credit Act, it is now making sure that both the creditor and the clients can be the businesses themselves. They are all treated fairly without each one's interests being violated. So please remember what I said, the key words. I said National Credit Act is there to facilitate credit marketing. It is only speaking to credit granting, nothing else. The first thing, as we have already indicated, it is one first very important aspect, which is called the purposes of the National Credit Act. Now, these purposes, always when they're going to be assessed in your assessment, it depends on the action verb used. If it's going to be outlined, definitely it means we are only going to be touching on important points. But if you're going to be expected to discuss, that means it will be time for you to earn yourself more marks. And how does one manage to be able to earn more marks when you're discussing the purposes? The only solution is remember the keywords that are used in the description of the purposes of the National Credit Act. If you look, for instance, what I've already indicated, the first one, I have used the keyword, which is competitive credit market. Now remember the picture. The picture was not really depicting any of competitiveness or fairness. So this act was introduced in order to promote what? Competitive credit market. So that market whereby the creditors and their clients are now working fairly, that's what this act is purposed. And then the second one, which can be a very key word to remember, just quickly remember or simply remember the key word or the word National Credit Regulator. That on its own, which is NCR, from that keyword, you can come up with a fully structured sentence. Because definitely, with the establishment of National Credit Act, the purpose is to introduce this NCR. Now, remembering only the word National Credit Regulator, then you can come up with a fully structured sentence. So it's not going to be enough just to say it makes provision of the establishment, then you add it up there. It's unfair in terms of the action verb used. So always look at the action verb used. Now there's another keyword that I want us to underline on these purposes. Interest of consumers. Now remember, I also mentioned the interest of consumers. If you remember the picture as well, you remember that it was upside down? Were the interests of the customers even taken care of? Never. So with the introduction of the National Credit Act, the purpose was to ensure that authorized credit providers, now there are two keywords in that sentence. You remember the word authorized credit providers together with more customers that are going to be also afforded. Now you are going to understand that these are two keywords in one sentence. Should it happen that the action verb used to assess, it says discuss for 2 marks, definitely it means for you to say authorized credit providers, which is a keyword. We are going to get a tick for that. And then also we're also going to be getting a tick for saying you find that these are not doing justice. Now just to go a little bit further, I want us to go back again to these purposes. We're still dealing with the purposes before we go to the other ones that we said they are really definitely aiming at ensuring that there is peace in the credit market. Another keyword that I also want us to look at, it says credit contracts. We are still in that slide. Credit contracts. So the word credit contract, it's not enough. It only helps you to remember the keyword to use when you're discussing the purposes of the National Credit Act. Then you continue to say again, look at that one, very interesting, debt cancelling services. Those used not to be there. So debt cancelling services is also a keyword that you can come up with it to make a fully structured sentence when you have to be explaining or discussing the purposes of National Credit Act. And the last one, that is also very interesting and very easy to remember when you're talking about the purposes, is called credit is available to all. On its own as a keyword, it's not enough. If the action verb was discussed, this was definitely going to only give you one tick. So, but once you also remember that when you talk about credit is available to all, that should also say to you, say something about discrimination. So as you can see, that remembering credit is available to all must also be partnered with another keyword, which is it prevents discrimination. Now, grade 12s. It's very important that I must emphasize the importance of remembering, looking at the keyword used, so that, on the action verb used, so that once the action verb is used, it's going to direct you, it's going to inform you how long should you respond. And avoid coming up with little phrases that are not speaking to the action verb used. So as it has already been indicated, remember to use keywords for you to remember the purposes of the National Credit Act. I think we are all together with that one. Moving further, let's look at the impact. What are the impacts of the National Credit Act? From the word itself, impact, I know already we have mastered the skill that once you see the action verb impact, it always goes with an action verb which is either evaluate the impact or discuss the impact. And definitely it needs you to come up with the advantages or disadvantages. Now that action verb on its own, it simply tells you that you are going to be writing advantages and disadvantages, or advantages or disadvantages. So remember now that because this act is coming to bring interests, both the clients and the creditors, debtors and creditors are now managed. So it is going to come up with advantages. Let's look at the first advantage. Lower bad debts as a keyword to use, resulting in better cash flow. Protects businesses. Now there is a word protecting. These businesses are protected. Remember, we were not only looking at the interests of the clients only, also the businesses themselves. But some of them, they would find themselves giving unwarranted credit to clients that are not affording, which ends up killing those businesses, and they end up not thriving. Some of them end up being closed. But good shot that we are now having National Credit Act. It now protects those businesses against non-paying consumers. Proceeding further, look at this one. It says it also leads to more customers. Now I see two more customers. There are two facts here that are speaking to more customers. It says more customers, and it's also another one that speaks to more customers. Now, the way you are going to be answering the more customers, it is part of your disadvantages, but answer it such that you answer it in the correct content and context. The first, more customers, it speaks to authorized credit providers. Now, who wants to go and save your money, or you want to go and loan the money from a credit provider that is not even authorized? We all shy away from such. So most definitely, once we realize that this is not a pyramid scheme, this is not an illegal institution, then we get encouraged simply because it is authorized. Then we all come running to come and arrange for credit. Another, more customers. How do we explain that sentence? It says, more customers through credit sales as they are now protected from abuse. Now remember the picture. You could see that there was unfair treatment. So there was an abuse that was taking place whereby our clients could not even have a word or a say. So, but now that we know that we are protected, definitely that is going to encourage a lot of the clients. Remember, when I refer to clients, I'm not only talking to individuals. Businesses on their own, they can also be receivers of credit. Remember, they're also buying from their suppliers. So businesses, now that they know that there were clients which now are having interests that is going to be entertained, and they've got a role to play, they've got a word to say, that is going to cause them to want to go and buy on credit. Therefore, for their suppliers, it leads to more customers. So remember, more customers, we've got two more customers under positives. So make it a point that you answer it according to content and context. I will sit together. That is part of the impact. And then can you go further? Remember what we said about the word impact is when you're going to be evaluating advantages and or disadvantages. Disadvantages, again, look at the action verb that is used by the examiner. Struggle to get credit. Now we are going to see that these disadvantages are more than the advantages. The reason why we've got lots of disadvantages under as the impact of National Credit Act is because they are there so that they can tighten up the screw, so that they can make it difficult for people to be getting credit as they please, because that kills the economy of the country. You can imagine if all businesses can give everybody that are not even warranted or qualifying, what's going to happen to the economy of the country? So for that reason then, we have to, the government from the macro environment came with this National Credit Act, and it has got a lot of disadvantages to tighten up this credit marketing. So there's going to be a struggle for businesses because they're now going to be searched. So not every individual or business is going to be granted credit easily. Another disadvantage, face legal action. So you can imagine that if there's going to be a business that's not going to follow the rules, but now that there's an act, obviously every act has got its own framework, has got its own procedures. So for a business, before it grants credit, it must think twice. That should I dare give credit that is unwarranted for, there are legal actions that are going to be taking place. Look at the debt collection procedures. Now, the procedure means the steps. Businesses or creditors have got to now follow some procedures before they can be able to just go and collect whatever that has been owed. And in the beginning, the creditors used to collect and attach and do as they please if they find out that they are not being paid as they were expecting. But now the disadvantage is they have to think twice now, because according to National Credit Act, they are no longer allowed. As you can see that it is set as it is, that there is no any way. Debt collection procedures are more complex and very expensive. So it's not easy for them to just go and collect. It increases administration burden, because really to keep those records, you've got a lot of your people that are buying on credit. Keeping those records, that information, filing. Sometimes even have to make follow-ups for those people. It's also very expensive. That on its own can discourage most of the businesses to provide credit. So that this is actually managing credit trading. And then lastly, I just have to choose another one that says it leads to loss of sales as many consumers may no longer qualify. Not everyone is qualifying. So for that reason, most of the businesses will be scared to provide credit. Otherwise, there's going to be a loss of sales. So do you see the importance of using keywords? Discriminatory actions according to National Credit Act. What does that mean? It simply speaks to, can you guess? Yes. When we talk about discriminatory actions, we're talking about that which is regarded outside, that which is regarded as incorrect, as non-compliant, that it is opposite from the purposes. So anything that is against National Credit Act, it is regarded as non-compliance, which is therefore means discriminatory actions. Now there are only 3 keywords you must remember for all your discriminatory actions or non-compliance. Only 3. Refusing because of gender, interest rates, blacklisting. Just to remember those 3 keywords, you can construct full sentences. Refusing. What are you refusing? To give credit to customers based on their gender. That is wrong. That is non-compliant. You are violating the provisions or the purposes of National Credit Act. Charging different interest to customers. That interest rate must make you to remember a keyword to use as negative impact of National Credit Act. So customers must be charged equally. If their interests are not going to be charged, let them be equally. Blacklisting is a disadvantage, but they are allowed to do so provided that they are going to be coming up with consumers that must be blacklisted simply because they warrant to be blacklisted. But otherwise, blacklisting customers without making efforts to recover the debt, then that becomes a discriminatory action. So it's wrong that there must be efforts first before you can start blacklisting. So it's not easy. But we find companies that are going to blacklist customers without following procedures first. But before you end up blacklisting, there are procedures that are set by National Credit Act. So remember, only 3 key words must be remembered as part of the discriminatory actions. The one that has got a lot of points. So there's a lot of discriminatory actions against the ways in which business can comply. You can also be expected, an action verb can be said, discuss those ways. Discuss all the ways that the business can comply. If you compare these ways, they are more than non-compliance. Non-compliance is only 3 keywords that you must remember, which I said are referred as discriminatory actions. But compliance, those words, the word compliance, we've got quite a number of those ways. Simply because if you look at most of our assessment, they always like to ask these ways to comply. But there's quite a lot of content there. So there are lots of marks that you can score yourself between the non-compliance, which is the discriminatory actions, versus compliance. So there's a lot that you can scoop marks from the compliance in terms of the National Credit Act. There comes this word, National Credit Regulator, as a keyword. And what is nice about it? It appears twice. So once you remember the word National Credit Regulator, you can also remember National Credit Regulator as well as one of the important, it is there to monitor, remember. When they monitor whether the procedures are done fairly, they are there to regulate and ensure that everybody is having access to this credit. So it's a body that ensures that credit trading takes place as it is required by the purposes of National Credit Act. Now, we've got it twice. If you can remember it twice, now let's look how to use it. Business should be registered. That's another word. So you can use NCR as a keyword, but speaking to registering. So that's a way. Once we see the business having registered with National Credit Regulator, then we know that this is one way that they are compliant. Another way about this NCR is submit annual reports. So the submission, so it is registration and submission. So these reports, they must give reports as far as how far they've gone. So if you look at the word National Credit Regulator, which can be used twice, remember that you're going to speak to the first one in terms of registration. Companies need to register. Then the second one will speak to companies must submit annual reports. Now I see another one which is called FICA. If you can remember FICA, it also comes twice. Look at your notes. There's quite a lot of them, in terms of checking the records, checking the affordability. There's quite a number of those ways in which the business can comply. But out of those ways, find those that you think can be best remembered. And for sure, if you look at these ways that can be best remembered, is to remember the 2 NCRs, which I've already explained how to remember and construct fully structured sentences. Then you get to FICA. FICA is an act. It's a legal framework that gives directions in terms of how is it that they must undertake this credit granting. If they're going to be giving credit, what is it that must be followed? What are the systems in place? All right. So FICA is an act that is going to look at the intelligence. It's a Financial Intelligence Contribution Act that looks at how is it. It gives orders, it gives ways and tips and plans and all the guidelines that the business must follow when they're granting credit. For instance, even the collection of debt. If they've got to collect those debts, they don't just do as they please. They must listen to what does FICA say. Now, FICA also appears twice. How so? Business must have procedures in place. Now they talk about the business. I've just indicated that there must be procedures. They must not just give credit as they please. I wonder if I'm making sense. Again, this figure also speaks to credit providers. So in other words, the business itself, if I'm the business, let's say maybe Mahlobo Furniture Incorporation is selling products or furniture to its customers. Mahlobo must have policies that speak to how are they granting credit. It must have policies that speak to whom are they consulting, so that these policies will mean that these procedures are in place and they serve as a way that shows that they are complying. So it's evidence. But remember that I said also, Mahlobo is also buying from his own suppliers. So as a business, Mahlobo, it needs also to buy from its suppliers on credit. Those suppliers also need to also have this figure. They also have got to have their own procedures in place. So figure speaks to two things: submission or indication of their systems by the business. Again, credit providers also must have their own systems as well, according to figure, by the credit providers. So already you've got 4 points you can remember, which is 8 marks if it could be discussed ways to comply or recommend ways to comply. So by merely remembering NCR come with 2 points and figure 2 points, then you are sorted. Penalties, meaning those are the consequences. What will happen? Now I want to emphasize the fact that before one can speak to these penalties, we always like to say that business is going to be fined. So it's fining. I'm not disagreeing with that, but make it a point that when you speak about that fining, yes, it's a penalty, but it should be in context. It should be relevant to the act that is going to be penalized. So don't just mention fine without giving a full description of what type of that fine. How so is it going to be fined? For National Credit Act, all those companies that are non-compliant, so we've got to come up with clear definition or explanation of what we mean by those penalties. The business may not demand payment or sue the clients. In other words, if for instance it did not follow the procedures according to FICA, if they are not really coming up with the correct procedures in terms of granting credit to their customers without checking their credit records, that business, should those customers not manage to pay, because sometimes customers, they are aware that this company is not authorized. So the penalty is that company, even if it can take customers to court, it's not going to be helped in terms of assisting them to recollect. So the business may not demand payment. That's a penalty. Another one is the business may not charge any fee or interest other than charges under the specific credit agreement. There are charges already which are there in the credit agreement. So those charges, they cannot be extended further. Sometimes businesses can be abusive. Maybe they say, because we have called you, you owe us another money. Because we have SMS'd you, you owe us another money. That is wrong. So the penalty is they cannot. Whatever charges that are there in the credit agreement, that's enough, not further than that. Court may declare credit of granting by the business reckless and may order the business, the customers not to pay. Can you imagine? Should there be any indication that shows that there was reckless granting of credit, courts are going to declare that null and void. So that business is not going to be getting whatever that it has offered as credit. That's a loss. So these are the penalties. So every business, before it grants credit, it must always think of these penalties. Consumer rights in terms of National Credit Act. Now, these are the rights that I also want to emphasize, that they cannot be just answered in isolation without writing full sentences. Now that we know that the credit market is now managed, there are two bodies that manage credit market, the NCR and FICA. Remember, I said the NCR is there to regulate, to monitor. FICA is there to give all procedures and systems. So, but now it looks like we are no longer going to have customers that are unhappy. They are now having rights, unlike before, when customers never had a say. Now we're finding consumers having some rights. Let's quickly look at those rights. apply for credit, and to be free from discrimination. I like that word, discrimination. What does that say to you? It says credit was granted before, and always there was this discrimination, either based on race or gender. But now that because we've got National Credit Act endorsed, discrimination is no longer, we now know as customers that we can apply freely. We are also having a right to receive information in plain, understandable language. No longer different languages that you can hardly understand with fainted little, fonts that you can hardly read. The language must be clear. The customer must understand what is being said. Receive documents as required. If there's a copy, for instance, that's going to stipulate the agreement, the interest, the duration, all those terms and conditions. The business, which is the credit provider, must have those documents together with you as the client or as a business that is getting credit. You also qualify to have got copies of those documents. It's a right. Receive pre-agreement documentation. Obtain reasons for credit granting that has been denied. If it happens that you have applied and it has been denied, you are now having a right to say, but what happened? I did apply. So you need to be given information or reasons why you have been declined. Now, quickly, if you look at this assessment, it says, now we're going to be looking as to whether do we now understand what it means when we talk about the assessment. Read the scenario below and answer questions that follow. Jimmy Trading Enterprise offer credit to clients who can afford. Oh, they're clever. Jimmy is very clever. Do you see that? He's now following what is the purpose of the National Credit Act. It continues to say, JTT checks their clients before granting loans. Wow, good. So that not everybody, even those that are not qualifying, they check them first. The business is registered. Oh, wow. Remember we talked about NCR? That business must be registering. That's a way of, it's part of compliance. So here it is, we see JTT doing that. It means they're compliant. Wow. Then it continues to say, JTT was accused of refusing credit to customers based on gender. Now JTT is doing something that is non-compliant. They're not being discriminatory. And then they also blacklist customers without making efforts. No, that's not what FICA says. There are procedures before you blacklist, remember? We did touch on before blacklisting. That is a non-discriminatory action. Before you blacklist, you have some follow-ups first. The question says, quote 2 ways in which JTT is compliant with National Credit Act and 2 discriminatory. Already we have indicated that. Can you see that? The first one, for instance, let's talk about compliance. It says, JTT offers credit to clients who can afford. We could write it down there. And then it also, under another one that is also compliant, the business is registered. That's a fact that one can also indicate. We can get a mark there. JTT checks their clients before granting credit. This is compliant. We can get a mark there. JTT was accused of refusing. That's another one that we could put under discriminatory actions. Are we together? So it's important that for you to be able to answer such a question, you must be able to know what is it that is discriminatory, what is it that is non-discriminatory. Discriminatory, remember what I said, you only remember 3 keywords. I can remember them. I can remember blacklisting, you remember? I can remember also interest rates, remember? So always ensure that you remember those 3 that I said they are part of our non-compliance. As far as the assessment of the essay, you must also expect an assessment on National Credit Act. Remember, this question is going to be assessed throughout the year, up until your final examination. You must be in a position to answer the questions based on National Credit Act, including your essay. For instance, they can say maybe, the National Credit Act of 2005, Act number 34, was introduced to ensure that businesses address the needs of consumer credit market. According to these, consumers have a role to play in the credit market. Write an essay on the Consumer Protection Act and then ensure that in which you are going to be including the following aspects. Outline the consumer rights. Do you remember those rights? So it means you must write them in full. With your introduction, ensure that you don't repeat the words from the preamble. You must have two facts to say, but you do not repeat the words that are coming. This is the introductory remarks of the examiner. So when you find yourself that you're struggling in terms of coming up with the introduction, come up with two facts which you can make use of the very same sub-questions. Take one of the sub-questions and paraphrase it to make your introduction. If it speaks about outline the consumer rights, in your introduction, you speak about the consumer rights that were not afforded before the endorsement of the National Credit Act. Come up with a phrase, a sentence that is going to show that you understand, but without giving the answer. The second point, you can just choose any from this sub-question. Maybe talk about explain the purpose of the National Credit Act without going further on those key words, because you are not supposed to give answers under your introduction. Paraphrase the purpose. Paraphrase and come up with a sentence that speaks to the purpose. Because remember, the macro environment has brought in this act because it was intending to fix all the unfairness and the wrong that was happening under credit marketing. Therefore, there are purposes without mentioning them. And then you can get yourself 2 marks. Coming to your body. Remember, we not always, we have to be very careful because our subheadings are actually including all these sub-questions. Our subheadings are actually the very same sub-questions as they are. So you can take them and write them down, then you come up with those keywords. Those keywords, it will also be depending on the type of action verb that has been used, which I've already emphasized. And then coming down to your conclusion, make it a point as well that with the conclusion, you do not take words from your preamble. You also make use of any other sub-question that has been left when it comes to your writing of your conclusion, which is only one sentence. Now, seeing that we are now able and we understand that in the assessment of the National Credit Act, let us not undermine it and think that it is going to be easy to remember if you did not make use of what I've already indicated in terms of you using your keywords.
Good day, grade 12 learners. I am Tsiriso Tlhaka. I'm here to proceed with the lesson. Hoping you had a wonderful lesson with Miss Grace Kwasana. So now we proceed with the last legislation or the last act, which is the Consumer Protection Act. This is also focused on protecting consumers. So we proceed and start with the purpose of the Consumer Protection Act. And as Ms. Grace has mentioned, the idea that the assessment will be based on 5 main subtopics, which is the purpose, the impact, the compliance, the discriminatory action, together with non-compliance and penalties to say if a business does not comply, then what is the government going to do about it? And we should remember that these legislations were developed with the thinking to solve the past injustices which used to happen during the apartheid system. But then now we look into what is their purpose, what is their aim, why did the government develop this particular act? So the focus of our act would be the Consumer Protection Act. So let us look into the purpose, which is the aim, why it was developed. So it was developed for this purpose. It was developed to promote responsible consumer behavior. So this is consumer protection, and it protects consumers when they're in the process of buying goods and services. This one is not focused on consumers who buy on credit, but is focused on consumers who buy their product with cash and also consumers who buy on credit. So it promotes responsible consumer behavior so that the consumer can know what is their rights and what is their wrong. And then it also establishes a national standards to protect consumers. So nationally, when we are talking about national, we are talking about South Africa as a whole. So South Africa as a whole establishes standards or guidelines on how consumers can be protected from businesses who would be taking advantage. And then furthermore, it establishes a National Consumer Commission, which basically provides guidelines on how to basically protect consumers. And then it also establishes a national standard to protect consumers. And we should know that consumers buy goods and services every day. So it's important for these consumers to be protected. And the last part of our purpose is the idea that it promotes and protects the economic interest of consumers by providing access to information. So the key part here becomes the issue of protection, or it protects. So basically the role or the purpose of the consumer protection, or why the government developed the consumer protection, was with the idea to provide protection. So this basically would serve as a role of the government. So the government is there to protect the consumer who is buying, so that they're able to make informed decision by making sure that the information is there before a consumer can buy a product, and to ensure that if the information is there, it goes back to the first point of our purpose, then the consumer would be responsible and would be able to make the best decision in the process of buying their goods and services. And then we look into the impact. The impact basically focuses on positives and negatives. And with the positives and negatives, the idea is to ensure that when the business is applying or doing something, we check what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of doing that particular aspect of maybe the content. So when we are looking into Consumer Protection Act, the advantages are the idea that businesses may be safeguarded from dishonest competitors, because with some competitors they would be basically in a state of taking the information of a business so that they use it to their advantage. But with consumer protection, such actions are dealt with, and some businesses would be safeguarded, especially those small businesses that are newly established. And then another advantage is that businesses may be protected if they are regarded as consumers. So if a business is buying from a supplier, then that business is considered to be a consumer. So the business gets to be protected in the process of buying their goods and services. And furthermore, it prevents larger businesses from undermining smaller ones. So that is a problem with these companies that have a lot of money. They take advantage of small businesses. They take their ideas, they take their innovations and use them as theirs. So the consumer protection as well ensures that there is protection, and even in the process of actually doing marketing, which is to advertise, then small businesses would be protected from being undermined by the large businesses. And then another positive is that a business may gain consumer loyalty if they comply with the Consumer Protection Act, which is the CPA. So if the consumer ensures that they respect the rights of consumers, or if the business ensures that they protect or respect the rights of consumers, then we're going to see consumer loyalty, because consumers would appreciate a business that is compliant and protects their rights. However, when we look into negatives of applying this particular act, is that confidential business information may become available to competitors, because we know that in the marketplace where buyers and sellers meet, or competitors meet, there's always a competition, and the competition makes a competitive advantage for a business. So in that case, some competitive advantage should be confidential. But because the Consumer Protection Act implies that businesses should provide information, some of the businesses might provide information that is actually their competitive advantage. So to explain what is a competitive advantage is what the business would use to have a competitive edge on their competitors. So it's basically what the business has while the other businesses do not have. But because of the consumer protection, that information can be revealed. And when that information is revealed, then confidentiality will be an issue that leads to the competitors having the information. So that can be a disadvantage for a business that is operating in a confidential clause. And then as we proceed, penalties for non-compliance may be too high. So remember, when you're looking into positives and negatives, anything that wastes time, anything that is costly to the business is considered to be a disadvantage. And anything that can ruin the image of the business is also considered to be a disadvantage. So when it comes to penalties, because the business will pay high fines, that is considered to be a disadvantage. So a business should refrain from not complying with the Consumer Protection Act. Furthermore, businesses may feel unnecessarily burdened by the legal process, which implies that they have to make sure that they respect the consumer rights, and they have to create provisions and ensure that information of the product is actually revealed in the product. So that can also lead to a challenge, and it would be wasting time for the business. So hence they would feel that it is unnecessary to perform some of the actions or complying with the consumer protection. So that can be a disadvantage as well for the business. And then when we look into the last negative is that they have to disclose more information about their products and processes, which is a challenge. Let's think about KFC and Chicken Licken. We know that everyone has tried to acquire the spice that is used by KFC, but unfortunately they will not be able to get that information because it's confidential. However, with Chicken Licken, they try to come up with their own spices, but it cannot get to the spice that is being used by KFC. So therefore, would say this can be a negative if KFC would be asked to disclose the spice they use, which would be information that can be used now by Chicken Licken to steal or come up with the same product and try to fight, because they are in the competition and they are one of the leading industries in your chicken fried industry. Then when we move to discriminatory actions, according to the Consumer Protection Act, this is considered to be treating other people or employees differently from how you treat others. But because now we are talking about consumer protection, this would apply to businesses if they're going to buy maybe from a supplier or consumers. So businesses should know this is considered to be discriminatory and should not be happening. So one, if a business denies or denying customers proper information about the product or service is considered to be discriminatory, because they are basically not making information available to that customer while they might make the information available to other customers. So that is discriminatory because they are not treating that particular customer in a fair way. And then another discriminatory action is basically treating customers differently based on their gender, age, and race. So that is also considered to be discriminatory according to the Consumer Protection Act, because it is the treatment that is differentiated according to the gender, age, and race. And then as we proceed, charging unfair prices for the same goods and services is also considered to be discriminatory, because everyone should be treated fairly in the marketplace. And then another one is that varying the quality of the goods when selling in different areas is also considered to be discriminatory, because now the business has to treat everyone fairly, because we are living in South Africa and everyone should get the same quality of the product. And then as we move further, that is discriminatory, and if the picture here shows that this should not be done, because this basically tells us that every customer should be treated fairly hard. But however, with discriminatory actions, people are not treated fairly. As you can see, your customers are denied proper information. Some customers are treated differently because of how they look, their gender, their age, and race, and then charging unfair prices for the same goods and services, maybe because of the race and age, is also considered to be discriminatory. And then let us look into penalties for non-compliance according to the Consumer Protection Act. With penalties, basically, we are specifying the idea that what would be the punishment for the business if they fail to comply. So their punishment would be, for instance, a contract may be rendered void, or a fine or term of direct imprisonment may be imposed to the business because they failed to comply. That would be their punishment. So a business might be fined, or the business might be given a direct imprisonment for treating a consumer unfairly. So that is one punishment. Another punishment towards the business could be the idea that businesses may face heavy fines or imprisonment for a period of not exceeding 10 years. So that is another non-compliance according to the Consumer Protection Act, meaning punishment for not complying with the act. Because remember, we're talking about legislation, which are laws that are set and they have to be followed. So if the business does not follow, this can be the punishment. And then when we look into government agencies may conduct audits, enact fines, and even dissolve your business entirely. So if the business does not comply, it might be closed or dissolved completely because of failing to comply, because consumers are very important for every business. And then another punishment could be the idea that businesses would be forced or will be forced to compensate consumers in line with the extent to which their rights have been violated. So businesses would be forced to compensate those consumers if maybe in the transaction it led to a medical condition for a particular customer and that information was not revealed on the product, then it would lead to maybe the business actually paying for those medical fees because they led to the consumer being injured or suffering a medical condition. So that's what they are basically saying. That can also mean a punishment for the business because it means the business would lose money. So that is punishment for businesses that fail to comply with the Consumer Protection Act. Now let us look into ways in which a business can comply. 1. A business should disclose prices for all products on sale. So whenever there's a sale, they need to produce and show prices of those goods. Another way to comply, provide adequate. What does the word adequate mean? Provide enough training to staff on Consumer Protection Act so that they know on the consumer rights, so that they are well informed as the staff of the business. Furthermore, all agreements must provide for a 5-day cooling period off. So in a case whereby a consumer has bought a product, that the business should know that there's a 5-day cooling off. If the consumer is not happy within the 5 days with the product, then they have a right to return the product. So that should also be known and be applied by the business. If someone brings back the product, the business should not deny if the product is within the 5-day cooling off. And then they should ensure that goods and services offered are standardized and of the same quality. That is really, really important, because if the products are not of the same quality, that is basically non-compliance or discriminatory action, because all consumers need to experience the same quality with the product. So they should ensure that products are standardized. And then those are rules to be followed to ensure that you comply with the Consumer Protection Act. And as we proceed now, we look into consumer rights according to the Consumer Protection Act. We have the following consumer rights. The first one is the right to choose. We also have the right to privacy and confidentiality. We also have the right to fair and honest dealings. We also have the right to information about the product and agreement. And we also have the right to fair marketing. We also have the right to accountability from the supplier. We also have the right to reasonable terms and conditions. And we also have the right to equality in the consumer market, and the right to return goods and claim refund. And the last one is the right to complain. It is important for you to know these rights and maybe teach your parents while you are studying, because these rights actually apply to everyone who buy goods and services. So you can use your parents as a learning now tool to say, okay, mom, when it comes to the right to choose, this is what you mean. You have the right to do so and so. Now let's start with the right to choose. With the right to choose, basically consumers have the right to choose the supplier or goods or service they want, so they have the right to choose. And we know that if you go to ShopRite, for instance, we have a bread section, and within the bread section you get different brands. You get your Sasco, your Albani, your Sun. You choose, so you have the right to choose. You don't have a right to be forced to buy something. So, and then you also have the right to shop around for the best prices. So you have a right to ask the prices and check which one will suit your budget. So as a consumer, you have a right to choose, and that means you have the right to choose the supplier of the product or goods. You also have a right to shop around for best prices, and you also have a right to return goods that are unsafe or defective for a full refund. So that applies to the right to choose. And then you also have a right to reject goods that are not at the same as the goods that were sample marketed. So what we mean by that is that some products were actually being sampled to say this is how the product feels like, and then you get excited because of the experience of the sample. Maybe they give you a small item and then you get to be happy with that, but when you buy now the larger item, you get to see that there's a difference between the sampled product and the actual product you are buying or using on a day-to-day basis. So this is what we mean. In a marketplace, you would have a right to choose whether to buy in this shop or this shop or this shop. shop. So this is basically a flea market, and you have a right to shop around for the best prices, and you have a right to return whatever product you have bought. You see here there's bags, so you have a right to choose on the best or a product that you really want and return the particular product if it's unsafe or defective. And then when we look to right number 2, you have a right to privacy and confidentiality. The right to privacy and what? Confidentiality. So consumers have a right to stop or restrict unwanted direct marketing. What do we mean by that? When your parent is being called directly and they try to sell a product or service to him or her, that is considered to be direct marketing. So then your parent has a right to privacy and confidentiality. So he has a right to stop or restrict the unwanted direct marketing. And then they also have a right to what? They can object to unwanted promotional emails or telesales. So whenever you are engaging in online shopping, you know that they give you an option to whether you would love their newsletter or not. So you can either tick yes if you would love to see their promotions, or no if you would not love their promotions. So that is basically the right to privacy and confidentiality, to say any direct marketing or direct selling can be restricted by the consumer. As you can see, you are protected from that. And remember, we are still talking about Consumer Protection Act. And then another right we have is the right to fair and honest dealings. So the right to fair and honest dealings, suppliers have not, or suppliers may not use physical force or harass the customers to buy their goods and services. So suppliers may not do that. Furthermore, suppliers may not give misleading or false information to the consumers. So they have to be honest, and they have to be honest, and then they have to be fair. Hence we talk about not using physical force or harassing. But then the second point now talks to honesty, to say suppliers may not mislead or ensure that they actually give false information to the consumers. So they have, the level of truth should be high for businesses so that they are considered fair and honest in their dealing. And then as we proceed, the right to information about the products and services, basically they were talking about in the process of buying, some consumers buy on credit and there should be contracts. So the contracts and agreements should be in a plain language and easy to understand. Hence we say information about the product and agreement should be clear. So even the language that is being used should be in language that is easy to understand. So contracts and agreements should be in plain language and an easy to understand language. Furthermore, businesses should display prices which are fully inclusive and disclosing all the costs in a case of buying on credit. However, when it comes to maybe consumers who buy on cash or buy little items, businesses should label products and trade descriptions correctly, and also provide information maybe about the ingredients that are on the product. So when it comes to maybe buying any item that has a contract, you need to ensure that the contract is in a plain language and in an easy to understand language, and then the products should be labeled properly and the trade description should be correctly, and the ingredients maybe should be truthful as well, because consumers have the right to information about the products and agreements. And then as we proceed, the right to fair marketing. What is marketing? Marketing is a process of making a consumer aware of what the business is selling. So the business has to ensure that they do it in the right way, and the consumer has this right in terms to marketing. For instance, businesses should not mislead consumers on pricing, benefits, and uses of a product. So when they are advertising, when they are promoting their product, the uses of the product should not be false information, because it might lead to the consumer actually buying the goods or service because of the false hope. And then as we proceed, consumers may cancel purchases made through direct marketing within 5 working days or cooling off period. For instance, if you buy items over the phone, sometimes you'd only realize when they get to be delivered that they don't have the features that they said they would have. So then in that process, consumers would have a right to cancel those purchases or return those purchases which were bought through direct marketing. So basically, The right to fair marketing emphasizes those two aspects to say pricing and benefits or uses of the product should not mislead the consumer. And then as we proceed to the right to accountability from the supplier, we are saying consumers have the right to be protected in a lay-by agreement. So that is one, to say if anything happens to the product while it's on lay-by, then the consumer would be protected. And it also ensures that businesses should honor credit vouchers and prepaid services that are actually there to reduce maybe whatever product that the consumer is trying to buy. But elsewhere, it also emphasizes the issue to say the supplier should provide quality and ensure that they protect the consumer in the process of a lay-by agreement. And then when we look into the right to reasonable terms and conditions, there we are talking about the idea that businesses should provide consumers with written notices of clause that may limit consumer rights. So information that may limit the consumer's right should be on the contract and should be clear so that consumers know what are they signing in their contracts. And then furthermore, businesses may not market or sell goods at an unfair price because the right emphasizes that the business should be reasonable and the terms and conditions as well should be reasonable to the consumer. So this is basically on the contract to say whatever clause that is on the contract that would limit the rights of consumers should be specified and bolded so that you know as a consumer to say my rights here do not apply in the process of buying these goods and services. Hence we say the business should provide consumers with a written notice of clauses that may limit consumers' rights. So that has to be explained clearly. Then as we proceed, the right to equality in the consumer marketplace, what does that focus on? It focuses on the idea that businesses should not limit access to goods and services. So whatever goods and service that is being sold should be provided to everyone who is in the market trying to buy goods and services. And then businesses may not vary the quality of their goods at different consumers. So different consumers should experience the same quality. It should not differ. So one customer should say the product is hot, and or for instance, one customer should not say the product is hot while the other customer says the product is cold. So everyone should experience the same quality, and hence we say businesses should standardize their product to ensure that consumers are safe. Or if they do not do that, then they would basically be a non-complying company, and we know that if you do not comply, there are heavy fines that can be paid. And then as we proceed, businesses should not discriminate when marketing their products and services in different areas or places. So quality should remain the same. Hence we talk about equality. And then the right to return goods and claim refund, you also have a right to do that, especially when goods are unsafe or defective or may be replaced. They may be replaced then by the supplier because those goods are unsafe and they're defective. And then as we proceed, faulty items might be returned for a full refund. So if a product is faulty, it might be returned for a full. So for instance, if your parents buy a fridge and the fridge is faulty, or when they're trying to put it on the plug, it doesn't go on, then your parents have a right to return that fridge to any furniture shop they would have bought the fridge from and then get their full refund. So that's what we mean. Your parents actually have a right to do that, and you actually have a right to do so. And then as we proceed, they may return faulty items if the fault occurs within the first 6 months after purchasing the item. So the timeline is very important to say within the first 6 months you can return the product if it is faulty. So it's important to know that information so that you get to be protected. Remember, we are teaching you about Consumer Protection Act. So this emphasizes that if you've bought a product, then you can have your money back if it's faulty or unsafe. And then when we look into the last right, which is the right to complain, consumers may use various methods or channels to complain about poor quality goods or service. This can be through the phone call, this can be through an email. These are different methods that a consumer can use to complain. And they can complain via customer care desk or consumer hotlines or the ombudsman. So that Those are methods in which a consumer can use to complain if they are not happy with a particular product or service that is being offered. And then now let us look into the activity based on the Consumer Protection Act and the National Credit Act. Now outline the consumer. These are direct and scenario based because Mem Grace has focused on the essay and some of the section B. So we look into a direct question because with your business studies we have direct and scenario based questions. So maybe question 1 can say outline the consumer rights according to the National Credit Act. When we say outline, you just have to specifically write them down or list them down as you remember. And then 2 is read the scenario below and answer questions that follow. So we have Pablo Enterprise. Pablo Enterprise sells furniture items and they disclose prices of all products on sale. Moreover, they offer customers pre-agreement statements. So let us look into that. Identify the act applicable to the scenario above and motivate your answer by quoting from the scenario above. So that is 2.1, and then 2.2 explain the impact of the act that was identified in 2.1 for 6 marks. So let us look into our solution. The first question, remember, was on outlining the consumer rights according to the National Credit Act. The first right is to apply for credit and to be free from discrimination. The other one is to receive information in plain and understandable language. And the other one is to receive documents as required by the Act, which is the National Credit Act. And the other one is to receive a pre-agreement documentation before concluding any credit transaction. So this would basically be marked with 2 ticks at the end because of the action verb which is outlined. So whenever question says outline, know that you will get 2 ticks at the end and you should not provide more details because we just look for the fact as it is, which is 2 ticks at the end, and then this is your 6 marks. And if you provided more points, this would be considered to be maximum because you have received your marks already. And then obtain reasonable reasons for credit being refused is also correct according to the National Credit Act. And fair and responsible marketing and access and challenge credit records and information is also part and parcel of the rights according to the National Credit Act. So this would consider to be max because already you have received your 2, 4, 6 marks. And then let's move into question 2. Read the scenario below and answer questions that follow. We have the scenario again. You have to identify the acts according to the what? To the scenario. Now, when we are looking into the act that is applicable, there is the National Credit Act because they disclose all information on the credit contract. Again, they offer customers pre-agreement statements. So if you can remember, this is part and parcel of compliance of the National Credit Act. So this would be 2 marks for the act and 1 mark for the motivation. We take 1 out of the 2, so this would be a total of 3 marks. And then when we move into the last question, explain the impact of the act that was identified in 2.1. What is the impact? What are the positives? The positives is that the business will experience low bad debts, resulting in a better cash flow. Furthermore, is that it protects the business against the non-paying consumers. These are people who would fail to pay credit on time because the business, if it's complying with the National Credit Act, is basically doing what we call a credit affordability assessment before they can grant a consumer credit. And then another advantage is that authorized credit providers may attract more consumers, as it was explained by Mem, and then it leads to more customers through credit sales as they now are protected from abuse. So businesses would have more customers because consumers who cannot buy on cash, they can buy on credit. However, the negatives are the idea that businesses can no longer carry out credit marketing. So it means they cannot sell their product using credit or try to attract consumers using credit selling. And then businesses struggle to get credit such as bank loans and overdrafts because they have to be checked if they do afford before they can be granted the bank loans and the overdrafts. And then as we look into the last one, businesses that do not comply with the National Credit Act may face serious legal action. Now, let us look into another activity now, which is focused on the Consumer Protection Act. We look into a scenario. Now, the scenario is still Pablo Enterprise. Pablo Enterprise sells furniture items and they disclose prices of all products on sale. Moreover, they offer customers a pre-agreement statement and then identify acts applicable. There we look into now consumer protection. Why? Because now I wanted to show you the difference to say sometimes the question is looking for two acts and you should be able to identify the acts using the scenario and how to comply with the act. Because when you're looking into first part of your scenario, it talks about furniture items, but this one says disclose prices of all products on sale. This has nothing to do with buying goods on credit. But the second part now says they offer consumers a pre-agreement statement, which will only be applicable when goods are bought on credit. So as you look into the answers, consumer protection, because they disclose prices of all products on sale. This is how to comply with the Consumer Protection Act. That's 2 marks. And then when you look into National Credit Act, 2 marks, because they offer customers pre-agreement contracts before they can get credit. That's 1 as well. And then you get your 6 marks just like that. And then let us look into a summary of our lesson. We looked into legislation, and in our legislation we looked into National Credit Act and the Consumer Protection Act. The National Credit Act was addressed by Ms. Grace, and then I looked into consumer protection. So let us look into consumer protection. We looked into the purpose, we looked into the impact, we looked into the discriminatory action according to the consumer protection, we looked into penalties for non-compliance, and we also looked into ways in which a business would comply, and we also looked into consumer rights according to the consumer protection. And remember, do not confuse the two, the consumer rights for Consumer Protection Act and the consumer rights for National Credit Act. Those two differ. The other rights protect consumers in the case of buying goods and services, and the other one protects consumers in the process of applying for credit or in the process of making a credit transactions, as it was emphasized by Ms. Kosana. And then as we look into the consumer rights according to the consumer protection, we address the right to choose, the right to privacy and confidentiality, the right to fair and honest dealings. We looked into information about the product and agreement as a right as well. We looked into the right to fair marketing, the right to accountability from the supplier. We also looked into the right to reasonable terms and conditions and the right to equality in the consumer market, together with the right to return goods and claim refund. And the last right was the right to complain. So that is basically the end of our presentation. Keep well. Goodbye.